All right, we would like to get started here. Well, we're on our next to last evening. Next week will be our last evening. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back in the spring for 12 more weeks. So this would be semester 1, and then semester 2 will come up after that. Anybody? I don't see anybody. It looks like a first-timer. Looks like we have our veteran crew here. Oh, Bill's been here before.
Yeah, he's been everywhere.
But he hasn't been here for a while. Welcome back.
Oh, good, you bet.
And Zoltan and Monica, raise your hand. They're the snack people, and they are really delicious. If you haven't gone over there, get over there. Come on, you got to eat some of that stuff. You can't eat just one. You're going to have to eat more. Next week's our last class, and it's going to be focusing on asking questions or answering questions. And then we'll give you during the week those questions to work on. Now, I had a question that came up in the question and answer that I did what we're going to be doing next semester was I answered it, and I actually answered it in my mind correctly, but I wasn't confident. So I went home and did the study to make sure that my yes answer was a true yes. And so the question was, it came from Alan. The question was, when unbelievers die, will they be judged by the Mosaic covenant? We're talking about today. If an unbeliever today dies, will they be judged by the Mosaic covenant? Most of you are shaking your heads no, and the answer is? The answer is no, and now I got to make my case. This is like Columbo. You know, in Columbo, you saw the crime first, and then you work backwards. Well, I'm going to give you the answer and work backwards. Yeah, I need a cigar. I need a little notebook right here. And I got to have an old car and walk around like this. All right, so what was the Mosaic covenant? Well, it was God's revelation to his people, the nation of Israel. And what we find from the Mosaic covenant is God's heart, character, and expectation. He is our king. He is our ruler. Now, you can break the Mosaic covenant down into 3 major categories. You have the ceremonial law, which is the law of worship, of liturgy, the tabernacle and things like that, the sacrificial system. Then you have the civil law. Civil law has to do with government and solving legal disagreements and this sort of thing. And then you have the moral law. And the moral law is an example is the 10 Commandments would be the moral law. Now, these laws concerning right and wrong, these are laws that apply to all cultures, all time. That would be called we're talking about the universal moral laws that are in the Mosaic covenant. Now, these 3 categories, they're not there in the scriptures. Those are man-made categories, but they help us understand how the law is broken down. It is like the word Trinity. Jehovah's Witnesses love to come to my door and say, Steve, you know, the word Trinity is not found in the Bible. And I just look at them and say, so? If a word's not found in the Bible, can't it be true? And they say, well, yeah, then what's your point? Yeah, these words are not in there, but this is basically how what we see in the scriptures is ceremonial, civil, and moral aspects of the law. Now, what are the key points of the Mosaic covenant? Well, it begins in Exodus 19. That's when it begins. It's conditional. The nation of Israel must obey. And it's bilateral. In other words, there's 2 people part of this covenant. There's God and there's the nation of Israel. God does his part, we do ours. You want blessing, you need to follow God. If you don't follow God, you're going to be cursed. It's a temporal law. It's not eternal, not like the Abrahamic covenant, which goes on and on and on. And when does it end? It ended at the cross. That's when the Mosaic covenant ends. Well, So who was it written for is the big question. And we get this out of Exodus 19, 5 and 6. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, talking to the nation of Israel, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words, and he's talking to Moses. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So the Mosaic covenant is written for the nation of Israel. It was never written for the Gentiles. It did not apply to the Gentiles, just to the nation of Israel. So what was the purpose? Well, there was a cultural purpose. It served as a dividing wall. You have all these pagan nations around Israel, and God wanted them separate. So some of those civil and ceremonial laws were put in place to keep the nation of Israel separate from those pagan nations. They knew how to worship. It defines sin, and it shows our need for mercy. It condemns us. So when did it end, or how do we know it ended? Well, we have a passage from Hebrews 8, 7, and 8. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, that's talking about the Mosaic covenant. If there had been nothing wrong with it, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one, what's that word? Obsolete. And what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear.
I'm in trouble.
Yes, John.
Wouldn't the resurrection be the end of it?
Because Jesus fulfilled the law. Good question. Jesus fulfilled the law by living by the law. He said that in Matthew, that he had come to fulfill the law, and he did. He lived a perfect life. He lived the life we should have lived and died. That's why it's on the cross, died to pay a penalty we couldn't pay. Now, the resurrection is the affirmation that God accepted the sacrifice on the cross, but it does end on the cross. The payment is paid. And that's why we have faith. That's why we believe in Jesus. We trust in Jesus. He takes our place so that we can be forgiven. If we stand before God, we're in trouble. We're going to be condemned. And what good is the Old Testament law? That's the question now. If the Mosaic covenant is obsolete, then what good is it? Well, here's some reasons why it's still important to us. One, it drives us to Christ. Galatians 3:24, therefore the law has become our tutor, which means teacher, to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. It gives us a greater understanding of God's character as we look at the law. There are universal moral laws embedded in there. And how do we know they're universal? Well, first off, we have the laws written on our hearts. We're going to look at that in just a second, but we have the laws written on our hearts. We can confirm certain laws are universal, but a better measure is the New Testament. If it's repeated in the New Testament, then we have affirmation that law still is in effect today. There are certain penalties, like for disobeying your parents. You were to be put to death if you were Israel. Well, that's no longer in effect. That was not a universal penalty. Good thing for many of us who were kids under our parents. I wouldn't be here if that law wasn't in effect. So thank goodness it's not. There's a new solid ground. I don't know if does anybody get solid ground from Stand to Reason? Anybody in here? A few of you get it. You should be getting it. It's a free newsletter that Coco puts out. And so I'm going to do this project of this Mosaic law. And what is Coco talking about in his newest solid ground, which came this week, he's talking about the law. He had a different angle than I'm taking it. But here's from Kokel talking about those universal moral laws. He said, perversion. Now, he's talking about it in the Old Testament versus today. Perversion is still perverse, and wickedness is still wrong, whether it is adultery, rape, incest, or bestiality, or any number of evil acts, all condemned by Moses in the old law. Even though the old law is obsolete, those universals are still in play today. Murder is still wrong. It was wrong in the Ten Commandments. It was wrong before the Ten Commandments. So yes, we can glean wisdom and moral guidance from the law of Moses for our own legal codes, but there are limits. And I just mentioned one was the penalty was death for disobedience for kids. So what standard will the unbelievers today be judged by? The same standard that was in place before the Ten Commandments were in place. God condemned Sodom and Gomorrah. How could he do that if there's no law in place? He did it because the law was written on their hearts. He condemned Cain for killing Abel. So today they're being condemned by that moral law written on their hearts. And where do we see that? We see that in Romans 2:12. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. That's talking about people who were not under the Mosaic law. If they sin apart from the law, they will perish apart from the law. He's going to say why in a second. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. In parentheses, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that here's the key, since they show the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Everybody, non-Christians, even if they reject Jesus, they have the law written on their hearts. Their consciences bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, even defending them. This will take place in the day when God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. So again, the standard will be the same. The Abrahamic covenant is still going forward. There was the Mosaic. It was temporary. It's ended. It's done. It's no longer in effect today. It's been replaced by the new covenant. And Messiah came under the Mosaic covenant, and the reign of Jesus is endless. He has an eternal kingdom, as it said in the Psalms. And right there at that point was where the Mosaic covenant ended at the cross. All right, you want to save that question, and I'll pray. We'll get Gary up here. Can you save it? Perfect. We'll save that question, and let me pray. Father, we're just thankful for the truth of your word and for your new covenant, that we can know Jesus personally and have a relationship with the Father through him. And we're thankful for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Come on up here, Gary.
Where's Steve? You guys are interchangeable.
How's everybody? You guys doing all right? It's good to see a familiar face. You can talk to Bill sometime afterwards. I used to work for him at FedMart about 1,000 years ago. Kind of a forerunner to the Costco's of today. Kind of dates us, huh, if we remember FedMart.
It was Denmark then.
Deadmart? Went out of business. Okay. Well, the goal tonight is to talk about the Old Testament reliability, and then I sent an email to everybody, so I hope you got the outline. If you didn't, just send me an email, and I'll get one out to you. And it's the kind of topic that's huge, and I kind of went selective as far as some of the things I want to talk about tonight, because it's really a big topic. And I didn't want to overwhelm you and just send you a fire hose full of information. So my aim is about maybe a half an hour, and then I wanted to throw the ball in your court. So I also ask you all to think about because as Christians, we care more, in a sense, about the New Testament, especially the Gospels, as they reveal the life of Jesus. So somebody says to you, really, you believe the New Testament? You believe those Gospel stories, 2,000 years old? Come on, get with the times. No, that's just a bunch of fairy tales. So I was asking you, so you might think about it in the next half hour or so. What would you say to somebody that challenges the reliability of the New Testament? We've got people like Bart Ehrman out there selling books by the gazillions that challenges this, that says it's fake, it's all made up. We don't really know what Jesus said. Don't trust the Gospels. And so now these Gospels are being attacked. So you ought to have something in the back of your head, and we'll talk about that later, to be able to come up with a response to some of these challenges. So here's the deal, and we're going to have to think about this as we go through. There's a lot less information. Isn't that obvious? If you're dealing with the Old Testament, you're talking thousands of years old compared to the New Testament, which is only 2,000 years old. But it's harder to track stuff down. You've got layer after layer of cities and things like that. You're going to hear things like people will say, well, it looks like, or it seems like, or it's most likely that. And so you get these arguments that rage right now in the area of historians and archaeologists and things like that. So what I'm going to give you, I'll just say for the most part, historians agree with it. There are some that don't buy into everything that we're talking about tonight. So that's fine. I think it's good just to hear what's out there, and then you can make up your own minds too later on. And part of the problem is that these cities sit in a good spot. Let's say Jericho, or Ai, or some of these towns there that are in the Middle East. And they were in a good location. Maybe there's fresh water, or they're up high, so they're defensible. You could keep the bad guys out. So when one city would get trashed, people would come along later and go, hey, that's a good spot. They put the city on top of that city, on top of that city, on top of that city. So you get layers, and then you got a problem we'll talk about in a few minutes with Jericho, because Jericho looks destroyed time after time. And the question is, well, which Jericho is the Joshua Jericho? So, people debate that. There goes some more discussion. I think about Troy, the city of Troy. I mean, when they found Troy, they found several Troys. There were like layers of Troy. And so the discussion continues. So I'm just saying it's tricky. It's kind of hard to nail it down, but we'll see what happens here. I just wanted to point out something here. I know I gave you some of this stuff when we talked about an overview of the Bible. So I'm going to go over some of this fairly quickly because I already did that. But if you look at these three red areas, you're going to find evidence, and I think really solid evidence, for the truthfulness of the Old Testament. There are records over here in this area of the world from Babylonians and Persians and even these nasty Assyrians. They kept pretty darn good records. And so you'll find records here that we're going to refer to. Certainly there are records in the Middle East. I'm going to tell you about a group of people that started yelling about 1200 BC. They yelled for help to Egypt because they said, we're being invaded. Well, best bet those were the Jews coming in. And so we'll cover that in a minute. So there's some interesting clay tablets and stuff that's found here. And then even Egypt. You'd think, well, what's coming out of Egypt? But actually, there's quite a bit of interesting archaeology and digs going on that's echoing what the story is that we get from Genesis and Exodus and so on. So enough of that. By the way, if you have questions as we're going through it, let me know. Okay. Let's do just a real quick view of the history here, just fast forward here. So we got Abraham, roughly 2000 BC. Nobody's going to sit here and agonize over whether that's exactly right, but ballpark figure. Moving down through Moses and the Exodus, and there's, what's that movie out now? There's a DVD that says maybe people got the timeline slightly off, and they're moving the timeline for the Exodus. It's Exodus something, Decoded, or what is it?
Something like hundreds of evidence.
Or patterns? Patterns of evidence. So you guys might take a look at that. That's kind of interesting. So I'm not going to worry about it, and I don't want you to worry about it, but just, again, sort of the ballpark. Joshua coming into the land somewhere around 1300, something like that, coming out of Egypt. David, now we're starting to get a little clearer. Most people agree 1000 BC. The kingdom split. We covered that before. You know that story. After Solomon leaves, the kingdom split. We get Israel north. We get Judah in the south. Assyria comes, picks off. And these dates, you notice how specific all of a sudden they've gotten, because we know these dates. These are definitely nailed down dates. So Assyria comes in 722 BC, grabs the 10 northern tribes. They just disappear. We don't know what happens to them. Babylon then rises, kicks the Assyrians out of the way, and then they come in under Nebuchadnezzar, and then they take the poor southern tribes that were hanging on, and they're gone. Persia then finally allows some of these captives to go back if they want to, and many Jews do, not all, but many Jews go back. So we're talking 450. That's Artaxerxes. He had this decree that says you may go back. So that's the quick background. So what's going on as far as Old Testament? We're talking Old Testament now. You have inspiration from God. You have the line going down, meaning you've got, let's say, Moses. All right? So you got Moses sitting there, and he's writing up the Pentateuch. But they're called the autographs, the original documents. They're gone. So don't think they're sitting in the Vatican someplace or Washington, D.C. or St. Petersburg or someplace. They're gone. The kind of material that they wrote on, just finally, it's gone. It crumbles over time. It's just a miracle when you can find the exact temperature that will preserve some of these things, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's pretty rare to find. So now you have what's called transmission, not translation, but transmission. That's just the copying of the documents, and that's going to play a role in a few minutes here. So you've got these continued over time, and people get a little nervous about that because they think about how sloppy they are when they copy things. I'm sloppy when I copy stuff down. They think, well, good heavens, if you're in about your 10th or 15th transmission, aren't you beginning to lose whatever the original document was? And the answer is no, but we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So we don't have the autograph. It's gone, but we have a lot of copies. All right, so does that make sense? I was fascinated. I mean, a lot of things fascinate me, I guess. I don't know. Never grew up. I just like stuff. Well, here's one of the things I like. I think this is amazing. If you and I copy things, we just copy stuff in a hurry. Okay, just get it done. For the Jew, sitting down, copying an Old Testament manuscript was an act of worship. It was devotion. It was serious business. So I wanted to share with you, and these are not the only rules, but I just wanted to share with you what it was like if you're going to be a copyist. You had to use special materials. You had to have a special ink that you created. You had to have special quills that were handled in a certain way. Okay, so just the materials themselves. You, as the copier, you had to dress and wash ceremoniously and do all these proper things because this is an act of worship. This is not, ho-hum, I got the afternoon, I'll start copying. I mean, this is your worship to God. They numbered, if you can imagine this, they knew in the middle of all of the 5 books of Moses, they knew where the middle letter was. The middle letter. And they could count, so they would count that. They knew the middle letter, and they knew the middle letter of the entire Old Testament. Now, why would they care about those things? Well, they would check. So let's say they're in Exodus, and they're working like crazy, and they come across a certain letter, they're stopping at that point. They want to double check. That may be 500, 600, 10,000, whatever spaces removed from the middle. So they count. And they go, I'm off by 1. Wait a minute. No. but they were that careful to measure these things. Can you imagine that? That just kind of, boggled my mind to think of. And they would read it aloud. I always tell my students at Palomar when I'm teaching English Comp, I say, read your paper aloud before you turn it in. And there are occasions where I'll ask them to read part of their paper to the rest of the class, and they'll start in, they'll go, da-da-da-da, and then they'll go like this. And they pause, and they said, oh, what I meant to say, John knows what I'm talking about. So you got to read these things aloud because it slows you down. I mean, you just read something, you read fast, but reading aloud, you slow down because it takes longer to get the words out. So they would read these things aloud.
It doesn't always, when you read it out loud, it doesn't sound as good as it looked on paper.
Yeah.
So I need to revise that.
Yeah. Yeah. Your ear will pick up all sorts of things, even punctuation, all sorts of stuff. And if there's a mistake, you don't say, well, I'll just scratch it out. I mean, that document went away. You tossed it, you burned it, you shredded it, you did something, but it was not in, sitting on a shelf someplace. Say, well, it's good enough. No, it wasn't. It had to be perfect. So can you imagine? I mean, it's just how long that would take to go through documents like that. But again, it was the act of worship for these people. And how do we know that all of that paid off? Well, the DSS stands for Dead Sea Scrolls. And you know the story of that. Up until, let's take the book of Isaiah, for example. The oldest copy we had, I say we as the Western world, the oldest copy we had was like 1000 AD. Well, Isaiah is writing in several hundred, let's say 700 BC, so you're talking 1700 years, and people looking at that copy from 1000 AD and they're going, I don't know. I mean, you got all this transmission going on, copy after copy after copy after copy. Maybe this is completely different than what it was originally intended. So here comes the Dead Sea Scrolls. It takes you back to about 100 BC. I mean, you're more than halfway to Isaiah. So how are they doing? Well, just take a chapter as an example, the famous chapter about the suffering servant. We're going to be hearing a lot about it. I love that chapter when we get near Christmas, huh? I understand in a lot of Jewish circles, they leave that chapter out when they do their readings because it's so obviously pointing to Jesus. They go, yeah, let's go to 54. It's like 52 to 54. But check this out. They looked at these documents and they said from 1000 AD back to the 100 BC, there was one different word. And in fact, I looked it up just to double check. Your Bibles will say that. You go to Isaiah 53, and I think it's verse 11. You can, if you're bored, you can go ahead and look it up now. But if you take a look, it'll say right on there something about not in the Masoretic text. And so don't let anybody tell you that we're not sure where the problems are in the Bible. People know. We've got all these manuscripts to look at. It's not a question of, gee, I wonder what was said. It's a question of which is the right one. We've got the alternate readings. So there's one error out of 166 words. So what is that? That's like way better than 99%, right? Okay, so enough of just, anybody have a question about the manuscript evidence? No? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to throw things at you to see what your comment is. Back in those days, people couldn't read, they couldn't write. A lot of the folks couldn't read and couldn't write, so the scribes were special people set aside to do the copying and the reading, etc. But it was pointed out in another lecture that I attended recently that the Hebrew script is only 22 characters, and those characters mean different things, such that the average guy could learn to write his name and so on without a whole lot of trouble because he only had 22 characters to work with. Whereas the English language, we have 26 times 2, 50 some letters to deal with. And therefore, there was a lot more reading and writing going on than what we gave credit for. Is that? Do you concur with that?
I'm with you on that. Yeah. Why is that? We have this tendency that we're all so smart and that our ancestors had to be really stupid. I mean, that's where Eric von Däniken got going years back. This dates me, I know, but back in the 70s, this guy came along and he said, for example, the pyramids were too clever for ancient people to do. It had to be aliens that came to Earth. You hear that one? And there's these lines down in Peru called the Nazca lines, and they said, yeah, that took some space aliens to do that. I mean, come on. So, yeah, I'm with you. They were far sharper, and Moses is educated in the court anyway of Egypt. So there's much, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, there's much that Moses says that had to come from somebody that knew the court and the court documents that came about. So, yeah, I agree.
So it helped me to understand how this was transmitted down to us today, when as much because of the simplicity of the Israelite language and the written language that they use. So it wasn't all that complex.
No, but in a way, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it's a little bit of a frustration. The Hebrew language has such few words, something like 4,000 or 5,000 words, and we have like 400,000 in English. So we just don't say he walked in the room. We can say he sauntered, he moseyed, he, stormed into the room. And we have all these optional words. English is so rich. And so the Bible feels kind of understated. You don't feel like you get quite enough information. You'd really like to know more of what's going on there, but it's kind of limited. And so in Genesis, people have been fighting for years over the word day, because it says day, day 1, day 2. And it's like, well, day in the Hebrew language can mean actually an extended period of time. So there you go. We're back to fighting over the age of the earth. Alan?
When you get into some of the people that are into the Hebrew language, you find that each letter represents a picture, represents a number. There's like a color. There's several things that each letter represent. And when you get into it and you start looking at things like in the beginning, all this stuff comes together to have special meanings.
Yeah.
So it can get really deep.
Yeah, it does get deep. Okay, so we're going to go through kind of quickly because there's probably less information as you get further in the past. So we're talking the Genesis time period there. You're probably aware of this, that there are flood stories in different cultures. So this is not peculiar to the Bible. This is not an oddity. This is not Moses just sitting around trying to entertain people. But there are these flood stories. And what I think is fascinating is when you compare it to the Babylonian text and all, the Genesis text is simpler. And most people who study these things about mythology and stories say that the early stories tend to be simple, and the ones that copy from them tend to start adding details. And so I think it's a good bet that the Genesis story was first and other cultures around shared it. But take a look sometime. You just go online, type in flood stories, and it's amazing how close they parallel. A small group of people saved on an ark when all the floodwaters come and stuff. It's pretty cool. I'll just give you one name here, the Amorites. The lists of people that Genesis talks about, they're starting to find references other places. At one time, people would look at Genesis and they go, they're not meant, this group, this culture, this people, they're not mentioned anywhere else. Well, now they are. And I'll give you some examples of what they've been finding. Long lives. How about the people that lived 900 years? You think, is that Moses just going nuts here again? No, they're finding this in other cultures. They've got these stories of their kings living hundreds and hundreds of years. So, whether you think that's just numerology at work and it's symbolic, or they're really that long-lived, I mean, it's going on in other cultures. They're finding that out as well. Okay, so I'm moving on past that. Patriarchal period, so we're talking about Abraham, his descendants, and so on. There are a lot of covenants there that echo, again, what other societies had. There's an order of inheritance that's in the Bible that echoes what we hear from something like the Code of Hammurabi. I want to show you something here that is kind of interesting. Inflation happened in the old days just like they happen today. Slave prices. Okay, I'll show you that in just a second. Haran. This is, I'll probably get it wrong, Abraham's father, I think. Yes? You help me out on that one? Is that where he came from, Haran? Okay, at one time, the only place people ever heard of Haran was the Old Testament. They said, hey, we've been digging all over the place. We've never found Haran. Wrong. It's in other languages, and I'll share that with you in just a minute. So here we go, inflation at work. If you read Genesis 37, Joseph is yanked up and sold off, and they got 20 shekels for him. Okay, move to Exodus. There's a law, and one of the laws of Exodus that Steve was talking about talks about if you kill a slave or accidentally harm a slave, you owe somebody for that, and the price has gone up is 30 shekels. Okay, so I don't know. I always think inflation is just our problem, but they had problems back then. And by 2 Kings, it's now 50 shekels, so it's getting harder to keep your slaves, I guess. Personal names. They're actually finding in different cultures the same names that dominate the Bible stories. We're still talking, the patriarchal period. The place names, I want to show you something in a minute, something called the Ebla tablets. Places like that, Haran is showing up in some tablets. And then people groups and geopolitics, all this stuff is finally getting reinforced. What the Bible was talking about is being found in other cultures. So let me just give you one example here. In the 1970s, which isn't all that long ago when we're talking, digging around and finding things, up in Syria, they came across this big royal palace that they dug up. And lo and behold, they went into some section there and they found just stacked with something like 2,500 tablets. And that's what they look like. It's got that funny wedge-shaped writing called cuneiform. Okay, so it's not like, Hebrew alphabet. So this is not a Hebrew thing. This is a Syrian Aramaic kind of language. And notice what it says in there. It's got words like Canaan and Haran. And then one archaeologist said, if you read these things, the cultures that they mention, the people groups that they mention, he says it illumines the Hebrew text point after point. In other words, it shines a light. It says, oh, this is what the Hebrew text, which is the Old Testament, it's what they're talking about. So what a find. I mean, just all these things. Now, here's my first warning, I guess. People in the 70s and 80s, when they first saw these things and they're starting to translate them, and it's kind of an odd language, they made too many claims about it. So if you type in Ebla tablets and you go to an older source, they're going to claim that the word Sodom and Gomorrah, those cities show up in there, and I forgot what else. But now that they're kind of retranslating, they understand that language a little better, they're kind of backing off on that, but they're saying definitely there are references that do tie in exactly, so they don't contradict, but it's probably stretching a little bit to say it reinforces all sorts of places in the land of Canaan. Check this out. This is a dig in a place in Egypt called Tel. There's that word Tel again, the layers of cities, called Tel El Daba. It's in the mouth of the Nile, where what's the word? Delta. It's in the delta of the Nile. I'll show you a picture in just a second. And what they're finding is housing construction that is not Egyptian. And it's only found, this kind of construction is only found, guess where? In the land of Canaan. So there are some Semitic people. Now, I'm not claiming, nobody wrote on here, I'm a Jew and I was here in 500, whatever. So they're not finding that kind of evidence. But I mean, it's interesting that they're discovering a pocket of Semitic life that was going on in Egypt at the right time for the Jews. So we don't know for sure that it was the Israelites, but interesting that it's not Egyptian. This is Tel El Daba out here. So here's the Nile, and it's turning all these fingers here. You guys ever heard of this little town up here, Rosetta? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, what was so good about the Rosetta Stone?
3 languages.
Yeah, I mean, they were just struggling with hieroglyphics, if you just have nothing but hieroglyphics, you got to have something to compare to say, okay, this says sun, okay. So then they find it in 3 different languages. One is Greek, and it's the hieroglyphics, bingo. And this was the time of Napoleon. So good news, they dug that thing up and said, wow. So it broke through and allowed them to figure out what the hieroglyphics are all about. So here's Cairo down here, Giza with all the pyramids and all that good stuff. So it just gives you an idea of where this all took place. So the Jews apparently, if this is legit, were down here in the Delta area. What other things? So I mentioned the house plans. What other things are they getting? Again, this is more like cumulative evidence. There's not one that's just a knockout 100% proof that the Jews were there. But they found all sorts of statues and tombs and pottery and all sorts of stuff that's not Egyptian. It comes from the land of Palestine or Canaan that's sitting there in Egypt, which seems kind of odd. Wall paintings, the Egyptians themselves would call these people from the East, they call them Asiatic. So if you ever see that term someplace, it's not really people from Asia. We're not talking Chinese or something. That was just their term for people from the East, the land of Canaan. And they found traders, and I'll show you a slide that shows some slaves and things like that. They mentioned, this is kind of tantalizing, they mentioned that there's a group of Asiatics who are in that delta, and they did not worship Ra. So the Egyptians thought that was kind of odd. Hey, you guys aren't worshiping our God. Well, that sounds at least tempting to say maybe it's the Jews. Public building projects built by Semitic slaves. Public records talk about Semitics holding high office. Does that ring a bell? Joseph, maybe? How about this one? This one is makes your eyes blink a little bit. They've got household lists of slaves that have distinctly Hebrew names. Wall inscriptions in Semitic languages. Now, this is all in Egypt, but they're finding these, remnants of some kind of outsiders who've been there. Can you see, I know it's not real clear, but can you see those odd robes? That's not Egyptian attire. And these were Semites that were going in. There was a lot of migration during this time period. So it wasn't unusual for the Jews to go down to Egypt. There was a lot of this going on. And they have an illustration. I always think of Joseph's coat. I don't know why. I guess it's not many colors, but at least it's a coat of colors. Oh, went fast. All right. And then here are Semitic slaves doing the hard work outside. Okay, yeah.
Jerry, I just learned something also that I believe that is appropriate, that slavery in that day was not necessarily 360 a year, but that's how they paid their taxes. They worked for the government as slaves for a portion of the year. Yeah. And actually some of those people were farmers and actually made money. Yeah. And that shows up when they made the golden calf out there in the desert. Where did all that gold come from? These people were not hurting necessarily. Yeah. And I thought that was an interesting aside when I learned that, it was suggested.
They pilfered a lot of that from the Egyptians. Well, yeah. On the way out. Thanks very much. And it's been fun being a slave, but we're on our way. Okay, this is something that just kind of appealed to me, and I just wanted to share it with you. I don't know if you've ever scratched your head over these total numbers that are in the book of Numbers, where they do the census and all. Then you think, well, that seems kind of weird, because it sounds like 600,000 are just the male warriors. Well, if that's the case, you got kids, you got wives, you got elderly, And the estimate has been, and probably a lot of your Bibles will say something about 2 million people, and you think, really, 2 million people going out in the desert? That's like taking San Diego County and say, let's go up to Oregon, we're just walking or something. It's like, really, is that going to work? Well, here's some responses I've heard of. Obviously, number one is that God just provides. I mean, it's a miracle. Okay, that's perfectly legit. So maybe you didn't worry about it. I just kind of wondered about this. Here's another thing, though. That Hebrew word that stands for thousands is right next door, and sometimes it's actually interchangeable for a group or a family or a clan, which means you could take 600,000 instead, take off this and call it clans or families. So maybe it's 600 families, which gets you down to about 20,000 people. I mean, that's a possibility. And that sounds more reasonable to get that many people through a desert, but maybe it's 2 million. Just seems like 2 million people leave some kind of track, some kind of trace. We just haven't found really much there as far as them being in the desert. I've also heard a possibility is, because you see this in the Bible, the number 7 is a big deal. The number 6 is a big deal. I mean, you have the Antichrist, 666, that there's, some numerology that these people would believe in. Maybe it's symbolic. So I don't know what the answer is to this, but at least it gives you some alternatives to think about. Okay, so they're in the desert. And we mentioned this before. I think we were talking about that Moses is a sharp guy, and the covenant that he brings to the people from God sounds a lot like other covenants that were done among nations dealing with other nations. They would have these little parts to them, a historical intro and naming witnesses and all this kind of stuff. And the tabernacle is not unusual. Other nations had sacred buildings, sacred tents, where their gods would meet with them. So the point is that the culture and the stuff that you see in the Old Testament is it's integrated into that world. It's real. It's not just make-up stuff. Okay, let's get them into the land. I mentioned this before. This was a time of social migration, and I want to share with you, and let you see a picture here in a minute. They found a huge cache of these clay tablets that were sent from people in Canaan to the Egyptian leaders saying, basically, help, we're being invaded. During the same time period. Okay, so and they've called the people that are there, they call them Habiru. They're the ones who are invading. Does that sound a little bit like Hebrew to you? Sounds real close to Hebrew to me. And it's controversial. So people say maybe it's just a separate group. It could be. But just to give you an example. So here's what the letters look like. This is the person who's in charge in that area reporting back to the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh asking for help. They've seized the land. The land of the king has fallen away to the Habiri. And now even the city of the Jerusalem district has fallen away, and that's the way they spelled it. Let the king listen to Arahiba, your servant, and send an army of archers that they might restore the land of the king to the king. For if there are no army of archers, the land will fall away to the Habiri. And so again, at least it's a hint, isn't it, that something's going on and they're desperate and they're starting to lose these battles.
That's kind of tough not having spell check on that. Chisel.
Yeah, no spell check. They've discovered a monument that's actually in Egypt, and I know you can't see it very well, but you could probably Google this. But it's a guy standing here, and he's got either a shield or it's just a representation on part of his body, and this is what that looks like if you could, transfer it over here. And they know hieroglyphics enough that then they translate it into language, and it looks like Tasasu Yahuwah. Well, here's what they're saying it means. Land of the Shasu, nobody knows exactly what that is. Those of, does that sound like Yahweh? And it's a reference, it's an Egyptian reference to the people living in Palestine, Syria, and they're calling them Shasu. I don't know what that means, but those of Yahweh. And so some people say, boy, it sounds like Yahweh. Is it? I don't know. But again, we're just kind of building a cumulative case. All right, here's another big chunk. It's a big granite piece about 3 or 4 feet tall, and it's called a stele. It just means you've chiseled something like a king's document about, boasting, I was here and I did this and I did that. Well, what's fascinating about this is they've got it dated pretty closely, 1200 BC. What's big about that is that critics, up until this thing got discovered, they were saying, hey, listen, this business about being Israel and being a nation and being in the land, you guys just made that stuff up. The Jews, it's probably in the 400 or 500 BC. They just want to sound like they got a great history, and they just made up this stuff. There was no land of the Israelites back then. That's just fiction. Well, what do they find here? This is a guy, he's an Egyptian pharaoh, who's made a raid into Palestine, and he's boasting about it. And what does he say? Israel is laid waste. Oops. There are Jews living in the land in 1200 BC. Otherwise, why would he say this? So he says, I went in there and kicked him around a little bit. His seed is not. Canaan's been plundered. Ha ha. So there's your king, mouthing off. But he's done us a big favor, hasn't he? He says there was an Israel, and they were big enough and tough enough, I went in and kicked them around. Otherwise, you wouldn't brag about it if there were 3 people there or something. But, there's definitely a group of people that he went and attacked. All right, here's another little fragment that's fascinating. Can't prove anything from it, but it's an Egyptian fragment that has things. It was a poem, and it has little pieces, and it says things like this. The river is blood, and one drinks from it. Does that sound familiar? Maybe. There are references in there to servants that are kind of like overthrowing their masters, and it's really upsetting. This is a kind of a negative piece coming out of Egypt. Okay, again, it does not name Israelites. But it's just kind of interesting. The river's blood. Isn't that odd to make that reference? All right, so let's get the people in the land. They're coming now in the land. The big complaint, or one of the big complaints was, oh, you Jews, you've talked up the land like there was something big going on there, like Jerusalem was a big city. It was nothing. If it was anything at all, just a handful of people there. And, of course, David came under a lot of attack. Oh, you just created a character of David. He's fictional. Come on. You just needed a big deal. Well, they found the palace of David. Oops. I'll show you that. They've come across another stele that references the house of David. I'll show you that in just a second. If he's not there, why do they have a house of David? There's another one from a guy who is a head of, his name is Mesha. He was a Moabite, and he went in and was fighting. And he mentions David, and he mentions Omri, another one of their leaders. Everybody loves the story of Jericho. Yes? Yeah, as a kid, I loved it. I think the destruction appealed to me. Must be a guy thing, maybe. But again, we got a problem because you got different Jerichos. And the latest I've heard, I tried to read up on this, is they have definitely found walls collapse, not just over time crumbling, but actually severely falling out. And those that don't want to believe the Bible can call it an earthquake. Okay. It apparently in this time it was a short siege because they found buckets of grain. Now, if it was a siege that went on and on and on where they're being starved out, you wouldn't have buckets of that grain. They would have been eating that stuff. So something happened in the springtime, and if you read the story of Joshua there, it is the spring. So you got the harvest has come in, but something happened and those people are gone. They found burned pottery, not just pottery that got in a hot fire somewhere and got, extra cooked, extra baked. And so it sounds a lot like that event. Now, can you prove it exactly? No. But it's a lot of it sounds really familiar, like the time of Joshua. There were 3 towns in the Old Testament that Joshua burned, only 3. And one is Jericho, and here are the other 2, and these are actual pictures. Can you see this dark area here? That's an ash deposit among one of those levels of the city of Hazor. Okay, not every city they find has that kind of stuff, but Hazor does. So does Ai. I couldn't find a cross section, but I was reading some stuff about these guys that have gone into Ai and are doing archaeological work. So there they are. You got some burned areas there. Okay, so I mentioned this stele from the Moabites. Look at the date on this. David's about 1,000. So it says it's got words like Yahweh. It's the first time you've actually seen the whole word Yahweh is written out. The house of David is in this thing. And Time magazine, not exactly a Christian beacon, right? The skeptics' claim that King David never existed is now hard to defend. So, I guess the overall message, by the way, here is that when a skeptic tells you something, just say, wait, let's see where the evidence leads. They're quick to attack, and then they have to back up. And then they find something else to attack, and they back up. It's been the history of archaeological research. Not too long ago, in 1993, so we're talking really close, they came across these fragments and put them together. It's actually a piece of something bigger. It's too bad. It's kind of tantalizing. But right about here, I forget which line, it's one of these two lines, it says, King of the House of David. And it's found in Israel again. So it's talking about the House of David. And it's, again, a guy bragging about coming in and kicking the Israelites around. So a king of Israel and king of the House of David. There's David's palace on the left. I guess you call it, if you're in real estate, a fixer-upper. Probably. Take a little work, but okay. I'm sure it looked better at one time. It's gone through 2,000 years of problems. Huh? And that's kind of a recreation of what they think. This is not just a little tiny burg. You know, Jerusalem was a good-sized city. They're discovering that more and more from the time of David. All right, then we have the big three that come along, Assyria. We have another stele from that land. I told you there's some coming out of Mesopotamia. They got this stele that says right on there, Ahab and Jehu, and it shows one of the Israelite kings prostrating himself in front of the Assyrians. You know that story about Sennacherib. We talked about that before. He wrote his own stele, and it talks about him going in, smashing Lachish, which is up north, coming down, and all he says is, I surrounded and I cut off the king of Israel like a bird in a cage. But he doesn't say, I beat him, because he didn't. That's Hezekiah. And Hezekiah prayed, and God strikes the Assyrians down, and Sennacherib runs back to his hometown. They found Hezekiah's tunnel. They set up a tunnel to protect their water source. So if a siege happens and you lose your water, that's going to be a short siege. So you guys ever seen the pictures of that Hezekiah tunnel? Pretty impressive. I mean, they're chopping this thing out of rock underground, and you can see it. I didn't bring all the pictures I could, but Babylonian Chronicle talks about what happened when Nebuchadnezzar. They tell the same story that 2 Kings does. We have clay stamps. I want to show you a clay stamp in just a second. Rick talked about that a week or two ago when he was here. Here's a neat story. Another critic area that they love to take was the story of Daniel and the handwriting on the wall. They're saying, who's this Belshazzar guy? They read these lists of kings that they found among the Babylonians, and they're going down the list, and they said, Nabonidus is there, but who's this Belshazzar? And they said, obviously the Bible got it wrong. They misnamed the king. Okay, I forget how many years ago they came across, are you ready? Came across something written by Nabonidus who says, my son Belshazzar will rule in my place, because basically he's bored. He doesn't want to be king. So he runs off. He spends his time just hanging out. I don't know what he was doing, but he didn't stay, and he let his son be king. That's why if you read the story, the actual story, the fine print, Belshazzar offers Daniel third position in the kingdom, not second, third, because he knows his dad is the king. He's doing it kind of as a regent, and then Daniel would be third. So it's not accidental to say third. It would be third after the other two. We got a Cyrus cylinder. I'll show you that. I think I showed that to you before. But there's the Sennacherib stuff where he's bragging about taking Hezekiah and putting him in like a bird in a cage. This is a blow up, by the way, but they're these little seals that they would put on official documents. And this one has the actual name of Baruch ben Neriah. So if you look him up, he's in Jeremiah. And it's got a thumbprint on the side. People are thinking we may be looking at a thumbprint of somebody who's actually mentioned in the Bible. Wouldn't that be cool? By the way, in Jeremiah, it mentions this kind of obscure person that nobody had ever heard of before. There was a Babylonian, and they've since found that name. So, if Jeremiah gets the little stuff right, I could trust him probably for the big stuff. Okay. There's that Cyrus cylinder, and I won't read it because we did this before, but this was allowing the people to go back to the land. That's the Persians being a little bit more open-minded and saying, okay, look, you guys don't want to be here. If you want to go back to your land, feel free to. All right, and I'll go real quickly over these. First Kings talks about an invasion from Egypt under a king, Shishak, and they found evidence of that from the Pharaoh himself. You read the Babylonian reports. They tell the exact same story of them coming in and taking off the children of Israel in the land of Judah. Daniel 5 is repeated in documents from the Persians, telling about them coming in and destroying Babylon. And then I wanted to end the Old Testament on these two things here. It's a double quote from this guy, Kenneth Kitchen. Steve was nice enough. He loaned me a Kitchen's book. it's a tough haul. I tell you, that's a hard book to get through. But here's what he said. I found something that sounded simple enough I could get it. He says the historicity of the Old Testament should be taken seriously. As for the OT text itself, we were talking about that. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide good evidence of a carefully transmitted core text tradition through almost 1,000 years. Thus, the basic text of OT scripture can be established as essentially soundly transmitted. There it is again. And the evidence shows that the form and content of the OT fit with known literary and cultural realities of the ancient Near East. Thus, we have a consistent level of good, fact-based correlations right through from 2000 BC down to 400 BC. In terms of general reliability, the Old Testament comes out remarkably well. Remarkably well. I don't know. Is he a Christian, Steve? Is he? Yeah. But he's highly respected. If you look at the book, it's just full of footnotes. It's pretty daunting. It's a tough one. So I wanted to share with you ones that are a little easier. I'm just thinking with Christmas coming up, honest to goodness, this would be just a great gift. And I get nothing from it. This is Zondervan. I didn't write this. But what's nice about it, it's got a lot of these pictures that I was giving you guys. It's beautiful. I mean, you could give it to, if you got a grandchild who's, just basically old enough, starting to ask questions about the Bible, or sitting there on Sunday morning. I don't know about you, but when I sat through the Sunday morning classes, I had the flannel graph, and it didn't seem real. I mean, at the time, it was kind of cool, but, it was like Superman or something. It's just kind of another story. And then you read this, and you go, hey, those are real people. Those are real places. Hezekiah's tunnel, that it is. There's Hezekiah's tunnel that I was talking about. But it's a nifty little thing. It's just all color, beautiful illustrations. Comes from a biblical perspective. I looked it up on Amazon today, and it's about a 10-year-old book, so you can get used copies really cheap. But there you go. Put that under the tree for somebody. I think anybody would enjoy something like that. So that's the one called Amazing Discoveries That Unlock the Bible. Here's something else if you like a different format. Focus on the Family put out something a little while ago called True You. And maybe you recognize the name Stephen Meyer. He's usually involved in intelligent design. So Stephen Meyer, it's like a classroom setting. He has a much better set of PowerPoints than I do. And he walks through the entire Bible, not just the Old Testament. So things like in the footsteps of Abraham, the Exodus from Egypt to Canaan, the Israelites conquer the Promised Land, and then goes right into the New Testament. So if you like seeing something rather than reading something, or you want to hand this out to somebody, that's a nice thing too. Another one that's pretty simple, and it's a lot shorter. Charlie Campbell, he lives right here in North County, and he's got a really good organization. It's called alwaysbeready.com. Look him up sometime. He has got so much information for you on dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, on Mormons, on archaeology. So he's got this, it's just him doing a presentation. This one's called Amazing Evidence for the Trustworthiness of the Bible. So that one's cheap and good source as well. Okay, so can I put the ball in your court for 5 or 10 minutes here? Is that all right? That's the Old Testament. So anybody have a question, first of all, about the Old Testament? Okay, I know I threw a lot of stuff at you there, but the takeaway is there's never been a find that you look at the find, you go, that's absolutely opposite of the Bible. They never find that. Sometimes they find stuff that they go, not sure. But they've never had anything directly contradict the Bible. They keep finding things, in fact, that support the Bible. Okay, so here's where you come in. What I've done is I've listed 9 things that I think make for some pretty good support for the reliability of the New Testament. But I wanted you to think about that, because you're probably not going to get very many questions about the Old Testament. I just wanted you to feel better about it when you go home and read it and think about, oh, that's thousands of years ago. Yeah, it is. But there is some evidence out there that at least suggests that we got a reliable Old Testament. But the New Testament is the one that you're probably going to be dealing more with non-Christians. So are there some things that you would say, yeah, I trust the Gospels because? Steve and I have covered things, gradually over the semesters that we've been doing this.
Well, there wasn't a lot of time that elapsed from the writings, from the eyewitnesses.
Okay. Explain what you mean. Mean by the time we got the writings from the time of Jesus, there isn't much.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't this big, huge, thousands of years for them to figure out and write down what happened. Relatively recent.
Oh, yeah. The New Testament documents, the Gospel documents are way closer to the times than like anybody else from the ancient world, Plato or Cicero or Caesar. Yeah, so that's a huge one. You've got manuscripts so close that you don't have time for mythology to come in. It's not a makeup of the Catholic Church from 400 or 500 AD. It's the first century stuff. In fact, I heard the rumor is right now that there's a piece of the Gospel of Mark from the first century, but they won't release it yet. Have you heard anything about that, Steve? Or?
Yeah, there's a controversy surrounding.
Okay, yeah. But anyway, they've gotten closer and closer to the first century. Did you have a question?
No, just a couple other things to support that. There's, you look at like the historian Joseph Flavius, who talks about the fall of the actual temple by the Romans.
Okay.
And when they talk about
hang on, he was saying that we've got this historian, Josephus.
Josephus, yeah. So basically, he talks about the fall of the temple by the destruction by the Romans, about 77, was it AD, something around 70, that. Yeah. But when you read the scriptures, they basically, the temple was still there. So it kind of gives you an actual third-party date to give you the closeness of the proximity of when those things were written.
Yeah.
The other pieces of facts for it is also the number of documents, of copies of the New Testament. They're like thousands, a couple thousand copies of it that are very accurate compared to like the oldest documents like Plato or the history of Julius Caesar's are in a few dozen. The other thing is the authenticity of how the stories are. There's a couple pieces. One is if it was meant to be fake or glamorous, you wouldn't talk about the faults of the authors. So a lot of the authors actually talk about their own, where they messed up, not believing Christ or their own fallacies that they did. And then the other part of the authenticity is if you're starting a new religion, a lot of the key witnesses for the resurrection were women. And back then, women weren't really considered reliable witnesses. But, in this case, why would you use, by Hebrew historic law that you're using someone to witness a very important event that wasn't really credible back in their court lands. So, there's a lot of things that kind of support the authenticity and the trustworthiness of what was written.
Yeah, so he was saying three things, basically. One is we have a whole lot of manuscripts. We have just a riches as far as compared to other ancient writers. There's not that much available. You have the best case is Homer. There's something like 1,500 copies of Homer. So that's impressive. Everybody else is like 5 or 10 copies. And so you got some things you can deal with, but the New Testament has thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. You've got the church fathers that reference the New Testament. They make comments about the Gospels. So you got like 1 million references there. Even if you lost every manuscript, you could reconstruct the New Testament just from what the church fathers said. And you're mentioning outside the New Testament, there are other authors that are not Christian that talk about the same events. They talk about Christ. I think it's Pliny says in his area, he's reporting back to Rome, he says, we got these people that are going out singing as if singing to a god, which is kind of interesting. In other words, the whole divinity idea of Jesus is not a late development. It was a very early development. And what's the third thing you said? Let's see.
Authenticity of the authors.
Oh, and the embarrassing things that are in the New Testament gospel stories. Why would you put the Gospels, why would you put in there, if you're going to create it 300 or 400 years later, and you want Peter to be the rock, to be the start of your church, why are you going to have him deny Jesus? He's going to stand there with a sword, and Jesus is going to say, no, Peter, I appreciate this, but just sit down. But no, Peter's running, the gospel, the other disciples are running, and Peter's denying him, and yeah, and the women. Yeah, the only reason you put the women in there is because it happened. Alan.
There's graffiti all over the Roman walls. The Christians had the little symbols that they used to show each other where they were. Because for 200 and something years, almost 300 years, they were underground.
Yeah.
And across all these Roman walls that they dig up, there's Christian graffiti.
Yeah. Yep. That's that famous ichthus, the fish symbol. If you take Jesus Christ, God, Savior, if you take those words, it spells out in Greek ichthus. So that's why they've got that connection. Anything else? Any other reasons that you would say I trust the Gospels? Larry?
You kind of already mentioned it, but the followers of the disciples, the eyewitnesses, the evidence in the chain of evidence was handled just like in the Old Testament. It was considered the Word of God. And like you already mentioned, the early church leaders in their writings, which are not in the Bible, in the New Testament, but they confirm the same thing that was in the Gospels. And the oldest copies of the New Testament are almost exactly like the later copies, and where there were discrepancies and differences, like Jesus and the woman accused of adultery, where they find that, it's annotated in new Bibles, like this was added later and not in original manuscripts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things that Larry is talking about is covered prominently in this book. If you want just a single book that's really a good look from a cold case detective for the reliability of the New Testament Gospels, it's J. Warner Wallace's book called Cold Case Christianity. And he talks about this thing called a chain of evidence. You have it in police work where you go out on a scene and you find a bullet casing or something, and then it goes into a file. And then somebody 2 years later pulls it out to look at it. They have to sign that they saw it. So you got this chain of evidence. So nobody's messed with it and then dropped it or lost it or switched it for something else. And there's a chain of evidence with the New Testament too, because let's take John, for example. He has a disciple, and his disciple writes the same account of what he's heard from John. The disciple of that disciple says, I heard this story, and the story never changes. It goes all the way through, and you can run it backwards then. So they're telling the same story 300 years, 200 years, 100 years, the time period of Jesus. It didn't change. This is nothing that gets added later. John?
I think two things. People do not give up their lives for a lie. That, to me...
That they know is a lie.
That they know is a lie.
Yeah.
They aren't going to give up their life for that. And secondly, Paul, you just look at the transformation of this person who was a known person, who was brilliant and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And the 180 that he did could not have happened if this wasn't real.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Rick?
Another thing J. Warner Wallace points out is the minor variations between the gospel accounts show they weren't copied, because that's the first thing that would
say that again, because
the minor variations between the Gospels shows they were not copied from one source. That's one of the first things he would find, that if he was talking to different witnesses to a specific crime, if they had the exact same story, then he know that someone's put that story out rather than there being actually eyewitnesses.
That one's fascinating. They are just kind of exploring this field right now. There's a first book out on this, and they call it either Interlocking Gospels or Undesigned Coincidences, which seems odd. I don't like that title. That sounds like it's just a coincidence. But I like the term Interlocking Gospel. They are finding, if you go to Matthew and you read the same story in Luke, that there are some slight differences. They don't contradict, but they don't always tell you the exact same information. So like in, I forget which is which, but Jesus is brought on trial and they slap him. They say, you're the Messiah. Tell us who slapped you. And you think, well, it'd be easy to tell you. You'd say, that guy right there slapped me. But the other gospel account says they put a blindfold on him. So one says just they came up to him and slapped him. And you go, well, that'd be easy to figure out. But then you read the other one that says they put a blindfold. You go, oh, okay, got the picture. There's a story of when Jesus is going to feed the 5,000, and he goes up to, I'll probably get the person wrong. I think he goes up to Philip. I got the right disciple? I think he goes up to Philip, and he says, hey, Philip, where can we get some food to eat? And you think, why is Philip the star person in this? And that's all they tell you. And Philip says, I don't know. And I don't think there's any food around. But if you read the other Gospels, one of the Gospel tells what area they're in. Then you go to a third Gospel, and it says Philip was from that area. So you put it all together, and what's Jesus saying? Hey, you're the local homeboy. You know, where's the Pizza Hut around here? And he said, I don't know. We're in trouble. But it took three gospel accounts to do that. And J. Warner Wallace doesn't see that as a problem. In fact, he says, like Rick's talking, that's a confirmation. He said it just rang true to him. He became a Christian as an adult. It wasn't a kid, he said he looked at it seriously. And he said, yeah, that seems legit. One other thing, I was thinking about what John said, something about Paul. You mentioned Paul. And I've talked to you about this way in the past. By the way, if you want any of these things, I'll send you stuff on the reliability of the Gospels. I've got all sorts of stuff at home. But in Paul's letters, he's got these little things called creeds. They're like little statements of faith. And he even tells you, I didn't make these up. I was given these. Well, think about that. Paul's writing his letters in the mid-50s to the early 60s, and he tells you, this is the creed that I got handed, which means they're older meaning closer to the original. And so if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, take a look at that sometime. He says, what I was handed, I'm handing on to you, and it's that Jesus did this, and he died, and he came back, and he was seen by Peter, and he was seen by this. It is so ancient. There are people, good historians, that say we're talking maybe a year within the time of the crucifixion. And guess what? It tells the same story. Jesus died. He came back. It was a total miracle. He's God. He should be worshipped. That's not something the church came up with 300 years later. It's there from the very beginning. So these are the kinds of things I hope you have in mind as you're talking to people about this. Rick?
Another thing that stands out is Luke's book of Luke and Acts. And the book of Acts does not talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 A.D.
Yeah,
and yet it was so prominent in the prophecies of what Christ's words were, that why doesn't it say that? So with that, you can trace back Luke's gospel to the other gospels and find out. Yeah. And they're talking about they couldn't pass that on at that time with so many eyewitnesses around if the facts were not true.
Yeah, you look at the end of the book of Acts, and Peter and Paul are still alive. Well, we know they died in the mid-60s, and the temple is not destroyed. So you would put the martyrdom of Paul if you knew he died, wouldn't you? I mean, you would put that in Acts because you got the martyrdom of Stephen, and Stephen's a pretty minor player, no offense to Stephen, but, if Paul dies, you're going to cover that. Well, the book of Acts ends, and these two guys are alive. So is James. We know James dies even earlier than Paul and Peter. So now, my mind and other people's minds, they're saying, okay, maybe Acts ends around 50-something A.D., and that's not the first of Luke's two letters, or stories. So you go back to the Gospel of Luke, which maybe is around 50, and that's not the first Gospel, because everybody thinks Mark's earlier than that. So I think you're back in the 40s. Well, you're within, you're certainly in the eyewitness time period, aren't you? People that would be alive at this time. Anyway, so that's just some things I hope you guys think about there. Do anybody have a quick question? Sorry, Steve, you want to come up in case people have a question for you? Bill?
Just a question.
Okay, do you have a mic for? Sorry, I ate up all.
No, this is fantastic, Gary. It's just a real contrast. I was 22 years with this church in Morocco, and to think that 1.7 billion Muslims are depending on a Quran. Out of 8 that were put together, but hadiths was kept, the rest were burned, and you've got 1.7 billion Muslims depending on a book that is so messed up compared to what we've got. It's just amazing.
Yeah, the Quran got copied off, just like the New Testament, the Old Testament. So it got copied off, but then, what was it, the second or third caliph says, well, we're starting to see different versions of it, and he just picked one. He said, okay, this will be the Quran, and we'll destroy all the others. So I'm hearing that they're starting to find that there actually were some of those others that were preserved, and they clash. They do.
All you have to do is read it and say, it's nonsense. That's all.
Yeah.
It's nonsense.
Yeah.
You have a question?
And if you have a question for Steve.
Yeah, I was just wondering, who's covered by the Abrahamic covenant still?
That's a great question. Let's talk about the Abrahamic covenant. It comes up in Genesis 12, 1-3, and the main 3 things that are promised there is that God is going to raise up a nation. He's going to raise up a nation. That nation is going to be blessed, and they're going to be a blessing, and that nation is going to be protected. Those are the 3 promises of the Abrahamic covenant. And so that nation starts with Isaac, and it was the nation of Israel. And so we watch the nation of Israel go all the way through, and then we get to the new covenant, and today the Abrahamic covenant is still in place, but we are now the ones that are being blessed. And Jesus is the blessing of Abraham. In fact, as I was looking up John's question about, why did the Mosaic end at the cross, I came upon this, Galatians 3:14. It says, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So both the Jews who are followers of Jesus and the Gentiles who are followers of Jesus, we are the ones who are being blessed through Jesus. Jesus is the blessing now of the Abrahamic covenant, and we get blessed through Jesus. And so the Abrahamic covenant is going to continue on all the way to the end. And it will be through believers now. The nation of Israel is no longer, as far as under the Mosaic covenant, it's no longer the one that is getting the blessing of the Abrahamic covenant. It is us. We who believe in Jesus Christ are the ones that carry on the Abrahamic covenant. Does that answer it? Semi?
Yeah, somewhat. It's still a little bit difficult to kind of comprehend that. It just kept on going. And
well, it does keep on going because Jesus is the blessing, and he keeps going. He's going to go to the end until he finishes things. So the Abrahamic covenant is, the nation is now us. We are the nation. We as believers in Jesus Christ. And we are, well, I don't know about how we are protected in a sense. The nation of Israel was protected because God made them so that they were not, that's why we had those laws about the ceremonial laws, the civil laws, to make them separate from the pagan nations and keep them protected. That's why the Canaanites had to be dealt with, because the Canaanites wanted to wipe out the Israelites. And so God commanded them to wipe them out. If he hadn't, the Canaanites would have wiped them out, and that was God's people. That was part of the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant is dependent upon God and God alone. It is not a two-person. If you remember with Abraham was asleep when God walks through the pieces. And it's God alone that is keeping the Abrahamic covenant going. It's his covenant and his blessing and his protection, and we are his people.
Let's go ahead and pray and then stick around and enjoy some more munchies over there. Father, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for wrestling around with some tough issues here and a lot of information. And I pray that we can just have confidence in your word and be able to interact with people during the next few weeks as we get ready for holidays and all, and realize that we have the truth and we can make the case for the truth of Christianity. And just pray a blessing on the people as they go about the rest of this week, and ask it in your son's name. Amen.
Thank you, gents.